had to dance a good deal. It would be all dark at first, and there were trees there, which made it much darker, and people would come one by one from all directions by a secret path which nobody else knew, and two persons would keep the gate, and everyone as they came up had to give a very curious sign, which Nurse showed me as well as she could, but she said she couldn't show me properly. And all kinds of people would come. There would be gentlefolks and village folks, and some old people, and boys and girls, and quite small children who sat and watched. And it would all be dark as they came in, except in one corner, where someone was burning something that smelt strong and sweet and made them laugh. And there one would see a glaring of coals, and the smoke mounting up red. So they would all come in, and when the last had come there was no door any more, so that no one else could get in, even if they knew there was anything beyond. And once a gentleman who was a stranger, and had ridden a long way, lost his path at night, and his horse took him into the very middle of the wild country, where everything was upside down, and there were dreadful marshes, and great stones everywhere, and holes underfoot, and the trees looked like gibbet posts, because they had great black arms that stretched out across the way. And this strange gentleman was very frightened, and his horse began to shiver all over, and at last it stopped and wouldn't go any farther, and the gentleman got down and tried to lead the horse, but it wouldn't move, and it was all covered with sweat, like death. So the gentleman went on all alone, going farther and farther into the wild country, till at last he came to a dark place, where he heard shouting and singing and crying like nothing he had ever heard before. It all sounded quite close to him, but he couldn't get in, until he began to call, and while he was calling, something came behind him, and in a minute his mouth and arms and legs were all bound up, and he fell into a swoon. And when he came to himself, he was lying by the roadside, just where he had first lost his way, under a blasted oak with a black trunk, and his horse was tied beside him. So he rode on to the town and told the people what had happened, and some of them were amazed, but others knew. So when once everybody had come, there was no door at all for anybody else to pass in by. And when they were all inside, round in a ring, touching each other, someone began to sing in the darkness, and someone else would make a noise like thunder with a thing they had on purpose, and on still nights people would hear the thundering noise far, far away beyond the wild land, and some of them, who thought they knew what it was, used to make a sign on their breasts when they woke up in their beds at dead of night and heard that terrible deep noise like thunder on the mountains. And the noise and the singing would go on and on for a long time, and the people who were in a ring swayed a little to and fro, and the song was in an old, old language that nobody knows now, and the tune was queer. Nurse said her great-grandmother had known someone who remembered a little of it when she was quite a little girl, and Nurse tried to sing some of it to me, and it was so strange a tune that I turned all cold, and my flesh crept as if I had put my hand on something dead. Sometimes it was a man that sang, and sometimes it was a woman, and sometimes the one who sang it did it so well that 2 or 3 people who were there fell to the ground shrieking and tearing with their hands. The singing went on, and the people in the ring kept swaying to and fro for a long time, and at last the moon would rise over a place they called the Toll Dale, and came up and showed them swinging and swaying from side to side, with the sweet thick smoke curling up from the burning coals and floating in circles all round them. Then they had their supper. A boy and a girl brought it to them. The boy carried a great cup of wine, and the girl carried a cake of bread, and they passed the bread and the wine round and round, but they tasted quite different from common bread and common wine, and changed everybody that tasted them. Then they all rose up and danced, and secret things were brought out from some hiding place, and they played extraordinary games, and danced round and round and round in the moonlight, and sometimes people would suddenly disappear and never be heard of afterwards, and nobody knew what had happened to them. And they drank more of that curious wine, and they made images and worshipped them. And Nurse showed me how the images were made one day when we were out for a walk and we passed by a place where there was a lot of wet clay. So Nurse asked me if I would like to know what those things were like that they made on the hill, and I said yes. Then she asked me if I would promise never to tell a living soul a word about it, and if I did I was to be thrown into the black pit with the dead people. And I said I wouldn't tell anybody. And she said the same thing again and again, and I promised. So she took my wooden spade and dug a big lump of clay, and put it in my tin bucket, and told me to say if anyone met us, that I was going to make pies when I went home. Then we went on a little way until we came to a little break growing right down into the road, and Nurse stopped and looked up the road and down it, and peeped through the hedge into the field on the other side, and then she said, "Quick!" and we ran into the break, and crept in and out among the bushes until we had gone a good way from the road. Then we sat down under a bush, and I wanted so much to know what Nurse was going to make with the clay. But before she would begin, she made me promise again not to say a word about it. And she went again and peeped through the bushes on every side, though the lane was so small and deep that hardly anybody ever went there. So we sat down, and Nurse took the clay out of the bucket and began to knead it with her hands, and do queer things with it, and turn it about. And she hid it under a big dock leaf for a minute or two, and then she brought it out again. And then she stood up and sat down and walked round the clay in a peculiar manner, and all the time she was softly singing a sort of rhyme, and her face got very red. Then she sat down again, and took the clay in her hands, and began to shape it into a doll, but not like the dolls I have at home. And she made the queerest doll I had ever seen, all out of the wet clay, and hid it under a bush to get dry and hard, and all the time she was making it she was singing these rhymes to herself, and her face got redder and redder. So we left the doll there, hidden away in the bushes where nobody would ever find it. And a few days later we went the same walk, and when we came to that narrow dark part of the lane where the break runs down to the bank, Nurse made me promise all over again, and she looked about just as she had done before, and we crept into the bushes till we got to the green place where the little clay man was hidden. I remember it all so well, though I was only 8, and it is 8 years ago now as I am writing it down, but the sky was a deep violet blue, and in the middle of the break where we were sitting there was a great elder tree covered with blossoms, and on the other side there was a clump of meadowsweet. And when I think of that day, the smell of the meadowsweet and elder blossom seems to fill the room, and if I shut my eyes I can see the glaring blue sky with little clouds very white floating across it, and Nurse, who went away long ago, sitting opposite me and looking like the beautiful white lady in the wood. So we sat down, and Nurse took out the clay doll from the secret place where she had hidden it, and she said we must pay our respects, and she would show me what to do, and I must watch her all the time. So she did all sorts of queer things with the little clay man, and I noticed she was all streaming with perspiration, though we had walked so slowly, and then she told me to pay my respects, and I did everything she did because I liked her, and it was such an odd game. And she said that if one loved very much, the clay man was very good, if one did certain things with it, and if one hated very much, it was just as good.